listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
Welcome to another edition of the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. I'm your host, Femi Abebefe. As always, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. Michael, Memorial Day weekend has come and gone. We have a fun episode of the pod on deck here. We're going to speak with Luke Russert, who became a New York Times best-selling author, also a Wall Street Journal best-selling author for his book, Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. We'll discuss or have a conversation with him later on in the podcast here. But it's been a while since we spoke, Michael. Memorial Day weekend came and went. You got yourself a new head coach for your favorite basketball team, the Philadelphia 76ers.
Yeah, I saw that.
Are you excited for the Nick Nurse era now in the city of brotherly love?
Yeah, I am kind of excited because I think this is a little bit when Larry Brown came to Philadelphia, and the Iverson situation. Somebody had to handle it. And just reading about Nick Nurse and Nick Nurse's methodology and his demanding and accountability, it's going to be interesting. I wonder if Nick Nurse is going to show Joel Embiid the scouting report on him about, make him work hard. He's not in great shape, that most teams have great talent, will tire if we make him work hard. I wonder if Nurse is going to approach it from that point of view and how he's going to try to get this player to realize that if he ever got in tremendous shape, if he ever got in great shape, then he could really become a dominant player. But, that remains to be seen. But I am happy with the idea that they hired somebody with a background of diversity in the sense of being divergent in thought, right? Mm-hmm. Somebody who's not stuck in, I got to do it my way. Somebody who actually can get down to the schematics of how do I make these players shine the brightest.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how this works out. Nick Nurse, of course, won the NBA title back in 2019 with the Toronto Raptors. And the only reason that he had a split with the Raptors is because, things run their course a little bit. And he and Masai Ujiri, the general manager, kind of had a difference of opinion, and the two decided to part ways there. Nick Nurse going into the open market. But he was a highly sought-after head coach. I mean, Phoenix was interested. A lot of teams were interested in Nick Nurse's services. He's been widely regarded as one of the top 5 head coaches in the league, and we've seen what that can do for an organization. I mean, look at the Miami Heat with Eric Spoelstra and the culture that they have. If you can implement something like that in Philadelphia, maybe you can get your boy Embiid, the MVP, to start kind of being a playoff performer versus just what we see in the regular season.
Yeah, I think, to me, if you just look at it and you see what Denver's done, they stuck by Malone, they have a culture. Of course, Jokic is their best player, and he's the best player in the league, and yet he sets the standard of excellence. So that certainly helps Denver. And then Miami's culture, as we all talk about, with Spoelstra and Riley. I thought Spoelstra's end of the year press conference after they beat Boston about how he had to pay respect to Boston and that he carries the torch for Pat. Pat believes this. He knows his job is to carry the torch. So, to me, that speaks for itself. I think too many of these NBA teams get so caught up in the analytical of it, And I was listening to Jeff Van Gundy, which was a fabulous interview on Ryan Russillo's this week. And Van Gundy was talking about, all these critics out there, and he was talking about analytics. So the best thing he said about critics was he said, and Van Gundy's got some incredible quotes. He said, how did he say it? He said, I wrote it down here. He said, rarely right, but never uncertain. Rarely right, but never uncertain. And that's most people that attack you on Twitter. They're rarely right, but they're never uncertain. And then he talked about, which I thought was really important for coaches, he talked about correlation and causability. We have this sense in sports that this is why Al Horford taking them to Topgolf was the reason why the Boston Celtics had that turnaround. Well, really it wasn't, but that was what we thought it was, right? And so I think there's, to me as a coach, and he causes it correlation versus causes. I'm going to write this for the Daily Coach, but I think it's really understanding why you win and why you lose. And most people can't do that. And most people's correlation to winning and correlation to losing is often very wrong. And I think that's one of the jobs that Nick Nurse has as he faces this challenge. I know you don't watch it, but I was watching the end of Succession with Millie the other night. And, Succession, for anybody who doesn't watch it, is really about a huge family. Who's going to succeed the family? 3 kids all trying to gain power, all trying to gain control. It's the old Springsteen line, poor man want to be rich, rich man want to be king, king ain't satisfied till he rule everything. Well, all these spoiled rich kids who've never who's never even worked hard to get to a finish line, they want to be at the finish line and win, right? And the one character in it, Tom, is the son-in-law of the woman of Shiv. He married him. And Tom is perfectly tuned to be a highly successful NFL executive, because he'll say whatever it says to make sure that whoever wants to do something does it. He is so primed for it. He is exactly why people struggle that have opinions. He'll do whatever. If you want to teach the world's flat, he'll teach the world's flat. You want to teach the world's round, fine. Whatever it is. I mean, they asked him one time, what's your leadership style? And his first question back to the guy that asked it was, well, what do you prefer? Like, he'll do whatever he wants. He's a puppeteer. And I think, to me, if you don't want to be a puppeteer, you've got to understand correlation versus causability.
No, that's interesting, because the puppeteer aspect of it, I think, is what we see oftentimes. I know in Major League Baseball, it's very big for the managers. The general managers kind of run everything from up the skybox and all that stuff. But in the NBA, it almost feels like you're a puppeteer for what the players want. And it's interesting because last night I was watching the Everything But the Chip documentary on the 2001 Philadelphia 76ers, and it was kind of talking about Larry Brown, Allen Iverson kind of butting heads and having like these moments where, like Larry Brown wanted him traded before that season started.
Had him traded.
Like they had it all locked in.
Matt Geiger revoked the trade because he had a trade clause kicker in it. Yeah,
and it just goes to show you, like, now it's more so where every general manager, every head coach is like, okay, how do we keep our star happy? Because we're afraid that the star player is going to ask for the trade or ask out, like how Kevin Durant did in Brooklyn, or how like James Harden did when he was in Houston to get himself to Brooklyn, or then ultimately get himself to Philadelphia. Like, everyone is so afraid to kind of have those heart-to-heart conversations because they feel like, oh my God, this is going to blow up, and then we're going to be back at square one.
Everybody's afraid of accountability, Femi. I mean, everybody's afraid of challenging somebody. They're afraid of your boy Kyler Murray to challenge them. They're afraid of saying maybe something that could offend somebody, and if you do it the right way. And I spent I spent an afternoon with Larry Brown. It was the highlight of my career, sitting there talking to him at a Barnes & Noble in Charlotte, just sipping coffee. And basically what he finally got through Allen Iverson's head was, hey, look, right now you're playing 1 against 5. Like, if we stop that and maybe we play 5 against 5, you'll be a better player, which is the same conversation that Nick Nurse has to have with Embiid. Joel, you're a great player. You just won MVP. You did it, and you're not even in great shape. Imagine what kind of shape, if you got in great shape, imagine how good you could be. Imagine what you could do if you were in good shape. And so I think that's part of coaching. I heard Shaq and Charles debate the other day. I love that Charles used the line, you're either coaching it or allowing it to happen. Yeah. It made me so proud, right? It was so good. But to me, what I loved about it was Shaq was dismissing the value of coaches, that it all comes down to the players. Well, it does come down to the talent, but talent alone can't withstand it. You got to motivate talent. You got to drive talent. You got to push talent. You got to get talent to play at a higher level than what they're capable of playing or what they think they're capable of playing. And I think you see that in when you watch some of these coaches. And I think that's Nurse's first challenge in Philadelphia is, look, guys, the reason we haven't gotten to the second round isn't because we're not coaching well. It's because we got to rise the level. Everybody, from me to you to everybody in this building. And it'll be fascinating to see. I wish I had a relationship with him because, I would be the eyes from the outside to tell him what the view is, because everybody in the building, I'm not sure, is going to tell him. Everybody in the building is going to be like Tom and tell him exactly what they're going to all be puppeteers, where sometimes we need, and I've often talked about this in all my conversations with speeching, is we need somebody who's loyal, tell you the truth, as opposed to somebody who's devoted, tell you what you want to hear.
And I think introspection is going to be a theme of this podcast, especially when we speak with Luke Russert coming up a little bit later. But I thought Allen Iverson in the documentary last night was really introspective because he said, my only regret in my career is that I didn't listen to Larry Brown sooner. And it was almost like Larry Brown saw this guy who's a crazy good talent. Like, this guy crazy talented, number 1 overall pick coming out of Georgetown. And then when he listened and started to buy into what Larry Brown was saying, he became an MVP player. And for Joel Embiid, otherworldly talent. But if he buys into what Nick Nurse is saying, and just not in Embiid's case, but in other cases as well, if you buy in when you have that talent, that's when you can actually become an all-time great player.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, right? I mean, how many players have we seen say, I wish I would have done? Le'Veon Bell finally admitted that it was stupid for him not to take the money from Pittsburgh. Thank God. He had everybody on the Worldwide Leader defending him, too. He had all these idiots on the Worldwide Leader saying, oh, it's great. Just turn down the $14 million. Sure, you'll make it up. I mean, there's $14 million laying out in the street somewhere, anywhere you want to get it. Just pick it up. It's no problem.
I'm still looking.
Right? Yeah. And meanwhile, these idiots on TV are defending him because they're too scared to say he's wrong. Right? Whereas opposed to, like how many times do you have to listen to an athlete say, I wish I. Let's do it now so you don't have to wish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good, because if you do it now, you can ultimately be like a Shaquille O'Neal or like a Michael Jordan or one of these guys that was so dominant. And just sidebar note, watching the documentary, because it builds up to the crescendo of the NBA Finals and that game 1 when Iverson has the terrific game, giving the Lakers their only loss that postseason. The highlights of Shaq. I mean, like, for people that think that Embiid would ever be in that world, Shaq,
they don't pay attention to it. They don't have any respect for the past. I mean, we live in such a future generation in terms of, nobody has any regard. I mean, J.J. Riddick's calling guys that played back with Cousy plumbers. I mean, that's so disrespectful. I mean, just pay attention to it. Watch it. I learned it. There was a time in my career where I thought Johnny Unitas wouldn't even have played today. And after watching it and writing the book, I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot. And I admitted it in the book. Like, I was completely wrong. I did a thing for NFL Films, and I was completely wrong about it because I was being arrogant and not paying attention to the history.
Yeah, well, we're caught up in our own time, and we believe that our own time is the best of the best, and that's how that ends up happening there. But yeah, like the Shaq highlights, it was just a nice reminder of, oh my God, this guy was the most dominant player of his generation, and we have still not seen anything that has come close to what he was doing out there in his prime. On the other side, let's get to a column that you wrote, Michael, for VSiN.com. You're talking about year 2 players needing to make that jump.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
Yesterday, Michael, you wrote the article for VSiN.com. It's a column, and you tweeted it out yesterday morning, and the tweet said this: there is no other second-year player in the NFL that has more on his shoulders in determining the success of the franchise this season than Desmond Ridder. And we kind of can talk about Ridder and the Falcons and also expand it further, some other second-year players that are going to be impactful for their teams going forward here. But Ridder, I think, is in a really interesting spot, and just kind of highlighting how these second-year guys can really elevate things. I mean, like, why did you decide to kind of go with Desmond Ridder as the face of this article? That's a really good theme in general. Well,
I thought, because I was trying to figure out, I was going through the depth charts and looking at second-year players, and I picked about 5 or 6 guys that kind of need to have big years. But then I looked at it and I said, like, nobody needs to have a bigger year than Ridder. So then I went back and I watched all the 4 games that Ridder played in, and starting with New Orleans and ending with Tampa. And he played against Arizona and Baltimore. And I tried to study him in the sense that understanding that they were keeping it very simple for him, and that they were trying to make sure that he got his feet wet, as I wrote about, and didn't make any mistakes and didn't hinder his confidence going into next season. But it got me thinking about, when you're a farmer in this world, you have to plant a field and you hope things come in. You've got so many variables in your life that you can't control: the water, the sprinkling, the weather, and the wind, and all these things, right? So Arthur Smith is almost like the farmer. He's got to control this one huge variable. Can he get Ridder to play at a high level? And people will say, this is one of the great things about the Van Gundy interview that I loved, is people have these takes, well, the receivers make the quarterback better. No, that's completely bullshit. That's completely bullshit. Like, did the receivers make Trey Lance better? Right? Did the receivers make Trey Lance better? Did the receivers make Carson Wentz better in Washington? I don't think so. Did the quarterback make the receivers better? Brock Purdy does, right? The quarterback is the driving force to making them better, where they throw the ball, the location, the timing, the rhythm, all those things. So this nonsense, well, we're putting better skill around them. It's bullshit. It's complete fucking bullshit. And so, like, Ritter has to step forward. And I think one of the things that I learned in my career, a lot of things I've learned in my career, is sometimes we fall in love with the hard worker. Sometimes we fall in love with the great character kid too much. And we don't look at the production, because Ritter's one of the great kids, right? He works hard. He's from a winning program. He's overcome obstacles in his life. The reason he's a third-round pick, Femi, is because he was so inconsistent in what he was doing.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that the character, I think, is a really good part of it, because I think character. Like, what do you say? The saying from Belichick, say character sets the floor. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Talent sets the floor. Character sets the ceiling.
Character sets the ceiling there. So it's like, it's easy to see why somebody would buy. Oh, this guy's a character guy. He's going to be able to reach his potential because he's going to work at it and work hard. But like you mentioned, what if that potential is not very high? You know, there's a lot of people out there who have really good character and work really hard. But if you're not that talented, and I'm not saying that Ritter's not talented. Yeah.
I don't think it's fair to say he's not talented. I think what it's fair to say is he's not consistently talented. Like, there's too many times that he hasn't been able to, do the things like the first game against New Orleans. He was god awful, right? I mean, he doesn't throw a touchdown pass until week 4 of the week 18, but it was week 4 for him. He was very careful with the football. He was very mechanical in his play, and I think, to me, the inconsistencies are what drives you crazy, because there's moments when you watch him play against Notre Dame and say, oh, man, he could be he could be Dak Prescott. He could be really good. And then the next thing you know, not so sure. So you go through that kind of, yes, the zig, the zag, all that, and I think that's what it is. He has talent. He doesn't have consistent talent, which is what we never talk enough about. We don't talk enough about player. We see a flash, but we don't see enough of the consistencies. It's a little bit like you have to watch. If you're going to sign a free agent in football, you need to watch the entire season of that free agent, not the clips of the free agent. You have to learn if you can live with the player. Could I live with this guy? Because there's going to be warts. There's going to be problems. You know this. And if you can't live with the player, it's hard.
You mentioned the inconsistencies. Where do they lie in Desmond Ritter's game? Is it with accuracy, decision-making?
I think it's accuracy.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's accuracy. I don't think he has a great ability to process as quickly as he needs to. Now, maybe that'll correct. Now, in Arthur Smith's offense, it's all play action. It's all, it's all going to be separate the defense and throw it here or there. He did not run the triangle passing game. He ran a high-low passing game when he was playing for him. So it's either you're throwing here or you're throwing there. If it's man coverage, this guy will break open. If it's zone, here's where we want to go with the football. And once his head turned to the side he was throwing to, that's where he was throwing to. Right? That's where he was throwing to. So once you get 4 games of that, right, the defensive backs are like, once he turns his head, just go. Just go.
I wonder what the ceiling is for their team, because if he plays well, they're set up to be a pretty good offense. But then you mentioned there that, like, hey, we don't have a lot of sample size on him, only 4 games. Arthur Smith's offense was kind of simplifying things for him in that year one to kind of keep the confidence up there. Do you see a player that can grow into that role of being a productive quarterback? Not maybe a top 5, top 10 quarterback, but at least like maybe a middle of the road guy who can at least be productive and take care of a football.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm not sure of. I don't have the confidence without the evidence. Arthur Smith does. And so what I try to point out in my column is Arthur banking on the character and the kid more than he's banking on what he's seen? And I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that they've made this decision. And what I wrote was this a decision that they had to make, or was it a decision they wanted to make, right? I mean, this is the option they chose. I didn't see anything in those 4 games that would lend me to think, okay, yeah, we got this guy. This guy's going to be really good. This guy's got it, And it's concerning because Purdy was really good, and he was an experienced quarterback. Lamar, when he came and played as a rookie, he was really good. He was experienced. Ritter, you can't say that he's not experienced. He played a lot of games. So that kind of worries you. Remember, last year, Atlanta was 31st in passing attempts, 31st in passing yards. I mean, they don't want to throw the football. They want to slow the game down, and they want to play 4 corners. I think, and what I try to do is, if you're betting the over at 7.5 on Atlanta, like some people are, and winning the South, like some people are, all of this is going to rest with your confidence in that guy.
Yeah, they've been the most perplexing team for me this offseason, just evaluating what could happen in 2023, because I don't know what we're going to see from Ritter. Like you said, like I only watched 2 games of Desmond Ritter. I watched the Ravens game. I had to bet on that when I bet the Falcons in that game. The way that game played out, like they should have been closer. They might have even won that game, honestly. A couple things went wrong in the red zone. Then I watched that Cardinals game, that last one there, which, I mean,
that was his best game. Yeah. He led him on a comeback from behind drive. Yeah. He led him on the drive,
Yeah, don't ask me why I was watching that game in Week 18. That game was just, it's like, what are we doing here? But I thought he was okay. Like, to me, honestly, when I watched him, he kind of reminded me, and I've said this before, I think on the podcast, or maybe it was on the Lombardi line on VSiN, but it was like a little bit of like a poor man's Ryan Tannehill, a little bit. Like, it's like kind of play action quarterback, will kind of do what is scripted there. But like you mentioned with the whole Trubisky saying that, hey, if it's how we practice it, it'll look good, but if it's not how we practice it, it's not going to look good. It's going to kind of fall apart. Like, do you see a little bit of Tannehill in Desmond Ritter when you watch him? I know they played in a similar offense there under Arthur Smith.
Yeah, I think it's more you see the offense than you see Tannehill. I mean, I always felt Tannehill was a better athlete than quarterback. I never feel like with Tannehill it's instinctive. I think it's robotic. I do see robotic in Ritter. But, I mean, look, he's got a whole off season. He's probably buzzed light years ahead of it, of where he was last year. We know this for a fact. But, look, if you stop the run of Atlanta, will you stop their offense? The difference is going to be this year is Mariota, when he was the quarterback, they could run, right? They had that 6-back attack going pretty good. Ritter's not really that guy. He's not really a great – I mean, he had 60 yards rushing last year. He's not that runner.
Yeah. No, he wants to kind of throw from the pocket there versus get out there and run. I know you always talk about Bill Walsh's quote there, but it said year 1 is when we develop the skills of the player. Year 2 is when we develop them in the system. Which other players do you think across the league are impactful year 2 guys that can help teams take that next step?
So I was going through that, and I was looking at, at the defensive line, like Detroit. Detroit didn't draft anybody in they obviously tried to help their defense and do all those things with what they were, this offseason. But I think the one kid for Detroit, that I was going through in my notes was the defensive end. I think they drafted him in the 2nd round last year. Hold on, I'll just get his name. Pascal, the kid they drafted in the 2nd round of 22, he had 2 sacks. He, had like 30 tackles. I mean, they need Pascal to have a really good year. Kaminsky, the kid that they signed from Atlanta, played better than him. He needs to take that Mother May I step up, right? And that's really the key to teams being successful is what player, the Kalafasis kid from Purdue for Kansas City. Can he really be? He had 6 sacks last year, but can he be the starter and replace a Frank Clark, or was he just better as an alternate? Those are the kind of players that you really need. Atlanta has a bunch of them on defense. I mean, that's one of the things Atlanta, if you like Atlanta, they've got a bunch of guys that they need to take that step up. Trey Anderson, the linebacker, as you go through it, they had another kid in there that they really kind of feel like that he could step up along with some of the guys that they have. But for me, that's going to be the key.
What about Big Daddy's team, the Green Bay Packers? They drafted those 2 Georgia defensive guys there, Corey Walker, the linebacker, Devontae Wyatt,
he played
the defensive
good for him
lineman.
last year. Yeah. Even Big Daddy was happy with that player. So, I think to me, they got a bunch of – I don't think Green Bay's as bad as people think they are. I really don't. I mean, they're Quay Walker, they're going to get that defensive lineman that they drafted last year in there. Was it Devin Wyatt? They got that kid,
Wyatt. Yep.
Devontae Wyatt. They get him to go in there. I mean, I think they're going to be pretty good on defense. They're going to come back and see what they are. The question mark is going to be the quarterback. How good is he, and can he make enough plays, and are they too young?
Big Daddy on board?
He's never on board. He's like me with the Sixers. He's got perpetual doubt. Perpetual doubt. It's a great thing to have. Perpetual doubt.
Is he the one that wrote the Athletic piece about Gutekunst and all the Rodgers stuff? Is he?
I mean, that's news today. I mean, it's unbelievable. I love how that comes out. I'm so jacked for Luke Russert in the next block. I really am. I love the book. I loved reading it. Such a Buffalo Bills fan. Get your Bills questions ready, Femi.
I got him ready. I got him ready among some other questions as well. But Luke Russert will join us next. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller for the book Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. Cannot wait for this. It's coming up next here on the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
All right, to continue our literature and leadership series here on the GM Shuffle, joining us now, a former Emmy Award-winning correspondent for NBC News from 2008 to 2016, New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller for the book Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. It's the one and only Luke Russert joining us here on the GM Shuffle. You've seen him all over the place, Today's Show, Meet the Press, CNN, Morning Joe, but he's gracious enough to spend some time with us here on this podcast. Luke, how we doing, man?
As Marv Levy once said, where else would you rather be than right here, right now?
I love it. I love it. Who else could quote the great Marv Levy? I love it. Well, I love the fact that, you're a huge Buffalo Bills fan, which is important to your life. I love that. I love that when you traveled, you wore a Bills yarmulke when you went to the Holy City. I love that. But I want to start off with, you had a great line in the book. You said, you said money from death helped you explore life. So you took this money that you inherited from your father, and then you wanted to explore your life. And I thought that was a really powerful, powerful statement to make, because you kind of put it in perspective. You weren't wasting the money, you were exploring your life. And in that exploration, you learned a lot about yourself.
Yeah. I worked at NBC News from shortly after my father died in 2008 through 2016. And I had reached a point where, quite frankly, I was unfulfilled. I had a great gig going. There was a real upward trajectory. I was not at the top level, but I was playing with the top players, and there was a pathway forward if I wanted to take it. But as I narrowed in on becoming 30 years old, I realized that the light at the end of the tunnel was a little bit brighter. I lost my father at 28, at 58. He was 58. I lost a friend of mine at 27. And you realize that, okay, you may have had this success, but why are these voices in your head telling you to reevaluate? That perhaps you are more than just this job and just this city that you grew up in, this Washington political bubble. And I had a chance meeting with House Speaker John Boehner, who I had covered rather relentlessly as a reporter, and he pulled me aside and he asked me a very simple question, which was, what are you doing here? Asking me about Capitol Hill. And I said, I don't have a good answer. And he said, you got to think about that, because I've seen people stay in a position for 20, 30, 40, 50 years and not know why they're here, and they lost their entire life. It just went by them. So I took that advice and I thought to myself, I've saved a bunch of money over the years. I'm turning 30. I also come into some from my father's insurance policy. Maybe I should take some time to sort of figure out who I am, independent of all of this and independent of my last name. There's no better place to do that than to travel and to get out from the United States and just get out from everything I knew and to find comfort in uncertainty. So I started to do that. And as I did that, I realized that there was two things going on. I was running away from something, and that was the death of Dad and processing that grief. And then I was looking for something, and that was, who am I independent of him, and asking permission to be my own person independent of him and his legacy, which is something I never really had the courage to do until I started to travel and think about it all.
It's interesting because I've seen you do plenty of interviews, and also just from reading the book and kind of just gathering it. It's obviously it's for not just yourself, but for everyone, because we've all kind of dealt with grief before in our past. But it almost feels like it's kind of an intra-personal book, to where it's like you were kind of seeking things within yourself. Have you always been like an introspective person, even growing up before your father passed away?
That's a great question. I grew up as an only child, and if you're an only child, you're naturally introspective, right? Because you have a lot of time alone in your room. There's not a sibling bothering you. Yeah. You have to sort of make believe and play with your own toys and make up a whole other world. So I've always had an element of that. But one of the things that I realized, especially in our hyper-connected digital world, is that introspection is more difficult than ever. And when you have a job, when there's the hamster wheel, you have all the pressures of a relationship and the pressures of your family, that a lot of that ability to take a moment, take a pause for yourself, that used to be easier before we were so interconnected with Wi-Fi all the time, has gotten a lot harder. So I would actually argue that those last few years in NBC, I was not very introspective because I was so focused on the career, so focused on moving upward, winning, whatever you want to call it, and not really realizing that, wait, why are these voices in your head? Where are these anxieties coming from? Why are you feeling this way? One of the things that I mentioned to a friend of mine recently, we had this conversation, was in 2007, I had this internship in New York City, and I actually spent 7 straight weeks in Midtown Manhattan in the summer, like never leaving New York City. So in the middle of the concrete and the hustle and bustle, and it was a wild experience. And this kid who I had met in the internship, he said to me, he was a native New York City kid. He goes, you know what? He goes, this weekend, we got to take a train just somewhere out to Connecticut. He goes, I don't know where, but we just got to go. And this is what we city kids do. We go out and breathe, right? And I remember the feeling of breathing that air for the first time after being in Midtown for 7 weeks. It was just like, oh, hallelujah, right? I would argue that now we're so interconnected that it's like we're all constantly living in Midtown Manhattan for 7 straight weeks in the summer, with the way phones and social media are and everything. So it's really important to take a beat and take a pause when you can.
I thought the book just reeks with authenticity. And I think when people connect to authenticity, I think that's one of Springsteen's greatest strengths. And I've got a lot of Springsteen-related comments here. But, you know, his ability to be authentic and connect to his audience, I thought it resonated in this book. And I wonder, twofold question. I wonder, A, how you wrote. I know you in the book you talk about journaling and writing. Did you use a computer? And if you did, how did you work it? Were you planning on writing a book? That would be A. And B, did you always feel this honest when you started, or did an editor say to you, look, you're going to have to dig a little deeper? Because when I started writing Gridiron Genius, the great editor Neil Fine says to me, Michael, this isn't going to be very good unless you want to dig a little deeper. Did anybody do that to you?
Yeah, I'll start off with the second part of your question there. The most creative is the most personal. And it's hard to be honest, but when you're writing a memoir, that's essentially what the reader expects. We've all read memoirs of people that paper over significant parts of their life where you're just like, there's no way you can only give 2 sentences to that. Now, that is the strength you have as the writer. You control the pen. You can do that. But I think a lot of people will read that and leave unfulfilled. And so why do you want to perpetuate that sense of unfulfillment if you've had it yourself? So I started out from a pretty honest place. But yes, I did have an editor who said, you know what, he pushed me further. But I was receptive to it. I think a lot of people are not. It's also a generational thing. You know, it's interesting. My mother, who's a very talented writer and journalist in her own right, writes for Vanity Fair. She's been thinking about doing her own memoir. But that generation is a lot less inclined to write about themselves in a personal way. It's just not something they ever did before, and they don't like to do that. So I found that interesting. The beginning part of your question, though, was I was going through a difficult moment in 2018. I had been traveling for a while, but I had not come across that aha moment yet. I had not had this clarity about what am I really doing here? The travel that had been so beneficial ended up becoming detrimental because I became quite untethered. And I went back and I reviewed the journals that I had kept from the beginning of the travels. And in those journals, I started to find some purpose. But to really explore those, I had to write them all out. And that took some time. And what I mean by write them out is that I went through the journals with a legal pad. I highlighted stuff. I underlined stuff. And then I wrote it out on a computer in a sort of story form. And there was sort of separate chapters, almost as a travel log. It was only once I got all that out that then I started to see the through lines of what I mentioned prior, which was this looking for something, which is the acceptance of being my own person from dad, and then outrunning the grief. Because I never dealt with the grief, because if I dealt with the grief, then he was really, truly gone. And that was a much too difficult thing to face in my 20s. It was a lot easier to store and ignore, white knuckle, and work my butt off and keep moving forward.
Part of the title is Grieving My Father. You talked about you had never really dealt with the grief there. Was there a pivot point or like a pivotal moment in your life there? Maybe it might have been when you were traveling where you decided, hey, like I should put this pen to paper and actually write this book and expand upon what you've been journaling about through your travels.
What happened for me was I had expected there to be this epiphany. Right, like I'm going to be on some beautiful hill in some foreign country, and an eagle will fly by, and suddenly the sun will rise, and everything will come and be clear. It doesn't work like that. There are moments like that. There are signs like that. But ultimately, what I found was in the writing process, these feelings that had been in my mind, I was able to bring more clarity to. And for me, the real epiphany ends up happening in the Holy Land, which I write about in the book, which is this acceptance of, hey, you might not have all the answers. That's okay. But know that your Father loves you and would never want you to go through pain or anguish to preserve his legacy. He would want you to do what's best for you and ultimately to be happy. And I was so consumed with trying to maintain a legacy, keep the flame of Tim Russert alive. I never really thought about that. One of the things is when my dad first passed, a lot of people took comfort in me being on TV. It was, the twinkle in Tim's eye was still there through Luke. And I enjoyed doing that for people. It made me feel whole. But at some point, while I was doing that, I wasn't looking inward. That introspection that we mentioned earlier wasn't there because I was so focused on that. And ultimately, I paid the price for it.
When I read this, I was going through it, and it felt a little Twilight Zone-ish in the sense that every encounter you had with somebody was a whole episode. To me, when you meet Kathleen in Moscow, that's Springsteen's, Eric Church's revision of Springsteen. It was a melody for a memory, right? You bring that back. The guy in the diner that provoked you, the Uber driver that was driving you crazy. I felt like, the woman on Easter Island that you met and you had a relationship with, I thought all those were like really mini stories that were moving you forward, even though you really didn't know it.
You're very perceptive. And yes, and I think that's sort of the Springstonian aspect of the writing is that you pick up little bits and pieces from the characters you meet along the way and from the environment that you live in along the way. And one of the things that I'm a big believer on is for self-growth, you really have to change your environment. It's easy to do physically if you have resources, right? You go somewhere else and, hey, everything's different now, I'm better. But you can do it internally as well. And there's so much value add to that because once you put yourself in a different environment, especially away from the safety and security that you once knew, and you are a foreign man in a foreign land, or you're in a new city in the United States and you don't know anybody and nobody cares who you are, it's a moment of reinvention, but in that reinvention, you can also look back on the parts of yourself that were good, bad, or ugly and start to process them more. And I think that's sort of something that Springsteen says, Michael, is in the sense of his songs, is that a lot of the times he identifies with the characters in his songs, and some of the times he's actually writing about himself. Yeah,
it was your Nebraska moment. I felt like this journey was your Nebraska moment. I just read the Nebraska book. We had Warren Sainz on that. I thought it was like your Nebraska moment that you just keep collecting this. And, one of the things when your dad passed away, MSNBC, you gave a great eulogy and everybody spoke unbelievably eloquent about all the things that your dad was a part of. And Springsteen sang Thunder Road at it. I thought Mario Cuomo had one of the great lines in his presentation, in his eulogy, because for us at Cleveland and then everywhere we've been, we've always wanted to hire Jesuit people because, as Mario Cuomo eloquently says, is they're trained at best to be defense and condemning people to hell. But that Jesuit training, it's one of the great speeches. People should listen to it. It is really, really powerful, and I think it really resonates when you write.
Yeah, it's something that my father grew up in Jesuit trained in high school, in grade school, high school, and then college. I went to Boston College and I received my dose there. And there's two things that the Jesuits do that are very, that I think practical, and they are something that you never really forget. One is a very simple question of, why can't you do more, right? And it's sort of what is limiting you from doing more, and have you given the most of yourself? The second thing is that you then reflect on that and reflect about what did you do today in the moment? What was the good? What was the bad? And sort of the totality of the person. And what's great about them is, they never quit on anybody, but in exchange for that is you have to give them something too. And I've always related to that. And it's an interesting mindset that I take out into the world is you're being perceptive. You think about what more could you do, but you also want to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of everybody else.
I want to take it back to kind of your days when you were at NBC between 2008 and 2016. Obviously, being a Russert, that name carries a lot of weight and still carries weight in that newsroom to this day there. But did you feel any pressure having that last name with yourself there? And also, when people inevitably had all the nepotism cries and they see your last name when they watch you on TV and say, oh, I'm sure that's how he got his job there. How did you kind of deal with that and coupled with all the pressure of being Tim Russert's son?
That's a great question. Somebody on another podcast said I was the sort of original Nepo baby, which made me laugh. I get that. I wasn't naive. I knew that was going to happen right out the gate. And when my father passed, I got that opportunity that really came from the eulogy that I gave. I thought long and hard about it because I knew that I was going to be put up against an impossible standard. But I also felt that it was sort of a divine intervention. The universe was saying something to me about, hey, go explore this. You play it up at a level, just do it for a year, if nothing else. And if you don't like it or you fail at it, it's at least a valuable lesson learned that you don't want to go into the media space like that and learn from it. I think the hardest thing is you're going to take criticism where people say you are on a very easy path. Everything's handed to you. So you have to react to that. And oftentimes is you work 10 times harder because you feel that I have to prove myself. I did that. And the fuel that you get from that is incredible. And you can tap into that energy. The problem is that at some point it wears you down because everything becomes combative in your mind. You do not necessarily know, am I doing this to prove somebody that I'm just as good as dad or better as dad, or is everything competitive and has to be a competition? And it's funny. I always thought there's sort of a few ways that the sort of famous sons of prominent fathers can operate. They can either completely disengage and just do their own thing, or they sort of hang around and be happy in the sidekick role, or they try and usurp their father. And you look at the Manning family, it's kind of interesting. It's like that in a way, right? The way the sons have fallen out. You have Peyton that clearly from day one was like, I'm going to be the best football player in the history of football and take all the advantages given to me and double down on them and make it so that nobody can ever say that I'm just Archie Manning's son, right? And you have Eli that's sort of in that space, but not as intense, right? And you have Cooper and the other guys who are like hanging back, like, oh, we're happy to be here in New Orleans and run the camps and look cool. And right. So it's sort of, you operate in that space and you do what's best for you, but there is a competitive fuel there. And you have to channel it and harness it. And for me, it was good for a lot of years, but at some point it became destructive because it's just not my personality. Like I don't have that Tom Brady, Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, this killer instinct all the time. I just don't. And my father, interestingly enough, was very competitive like that, but he was a happy-go-lucky, happy warrior, so he could be friendly and still have that competitive instinct. And I've often wondered, like, how is he able to do that? That's to me one of the most impressive things is that he would absolutely want to go out and beat you, wanted to rate higher, wanted to get the story, wanted to ask the tougher questions, would absolutely work nonstop, but did it with a smile on his face and was very, kind and good natured about it. Kind of like a John Wooden type, Coach John Wooden at UCLA.
Yeah, and a great quoter of Yogi Berra, too. I mean, he could quote every quote that Yogi knew. I saw, as I'm going through the book, I mean, you have seen the ultimate highs of what the world produces and the lows. I mean, the door of no return, the pilgrimage, that you saw. I mean, you saw some incredible things, and you were so good at being able to put them in perspective. When you were at the door of no return and, there you are and the guy's helping you who's, part of it and you're dealing with it and he's understanding it. Like, to me, I thought that was really good. And the airport scene where you're trying to get out of wherever the hell you were before they kind of closed the city down. To me, it was a great portrait of what's great about our world and what's also bad.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that came from 8 years of being a reporter, being perceptive of those things. But you talked about the door of no return. I think it's a very important story in the book, and I'm happy you brought it up. And it takes place in Senegal. And the door of no return is essentially the symbolism for what was slavery. Was that it was the door where slaves were pushed throughout and did the transatlantic voyage. And it's a very haunting place. And I sought it out because I think slavery is America's original sin. It's something that we're still dealing with very much today, the fallout from that. And I was always very curious and I wanted to see it in its firsthand. And the story that you bring up is that I have a guide there and we're going through the exhibit and he points at a an old painting, essentially, of a slave trader, and he points at the eyes and he goes, "Oh, you look similar." And I'm taken aback, and my first reaction is, "No, no, no! I'm Irish and Italian and German. We came here after, late Civil War. I had ancestors that fought for the Union, and oh, and by the way, we didn't like slavery because that we were working class and that hurt our wages." And as soon as I say that, I immediately go in my mind, "Oh my God, my instinct defensively is an economic one. It is not one of the horrific mortal sin that is slavery." And you look out that door and you suddenly appreciate the gravity of it. And that is something which comes through travel and it comes through self-awareness. But it's something that I'm so grateful I had the opportunity to do. And it's really why, more so than anything included, is that it's good to think like that sometimes. So oftentimes we get into our little bubbles and you grow up saying, "Oh, no, you're an Irish guy. You were here after the fact. You're from the North. Everything's all good." It's like, well, no, but it played into it somewhere along the line. Then think about that. It's okay. It's okay to process those emotions.
How about the silverback gorilla? I meant to ask that. I mean, I was scared the shit out of that one. I mean, there's no chance. I mean, my wife wants to go on safari. My best buddy, Bill Berman, he wants to. I'm like, no chance. I'm not dealing with lions and tigers and all that. No chance. And there you are with the right face to face with it, and you growled. I mean, that's impressive.
Yeah. So I went to Rwanda with my mother, and we went gorilla trekking. And these are the endangered silverback mountain gorillas, just incredible creatures. And you can actually go and in Rwanda, they have done a masterful job of keeping them secure and keeping them healthy. And the money from tourism goes back into the ecosystem and essentially keeping these animals alive, which is good. But they're wild animals, and they're very upfront, which is like if the gorilla attacks you, the gorilla is more valuable to us than you are. So, good luck. And you're supposed to, in the moment, you let out this growl to show that you're okay and you're not intimidated and you don't mean any harm. And we got super close to this one young male gorilla who had started his own family. They kind of roll in tribes. And what I write in the book is the sort of parallels of my own story. And I see this gorilla is striking out on his own. He had left his larger tribe. He's starting his new one, going out into the world on his own. And we see eye to eye and we lock eyes. And that's terrifying because this gorilla can kill you in 2 seconds if he wants to. And he walks by and we sort of lock eyes and it's the acknowledgement, and he goes into the thicket, and it's like, live to see another day, have a good one. Not really in danger, but it's the power of nature, the power of where we are as sort of humans in the world. And also like, I'm rooting for this guy. He's got a good vibe.
What was your favorite place to travel?
Favorite place to travel? As a continent, I really liked Asia. I thought it was just so fascinating, the history there, whether it was in Vietnam or Cambodia, and then the Japanese culture, just the way in which there's such a respect and decorum there was really neat to see. So I enjoyed that as a continent. As far as my favorite place, the most interesting is Easter Island. 5.5 hour plane ride off the coast of Chile. It's the most remote inhabited place on earth. It has those stone heads that you see on TV that are very mysterious. No one really knows why they're there. That's a place where it's so remote and it's so small that when the plane that brought you there takes off and leaves, the whole island shakes. You're like, man, I'm really out in the middle of nowhere. Like there's nowhere to run here. And that makes you think long and hard about life.
When I want to transition into some Bills questions, but before I do, when I first started reading the book, I thought this book was going to be your Springsteen song, Independence Days, your dad and you kind of having this meeting. And then I thought, no, it's Independence Day with your mom. And then when I got done the book, I think it's really, this book is living proof, a song Springsteen wrote when he had his first son about, finding personal freedom, finding yourself, finding why you're living. And he relates it to his son, but I relate it to my life too, is you find something bigger than yourself. You find out your purpose. And I think to me that's what this book speaks volumes to, is you found your purpose. And wherever you go from here, you've got this with you. As Brokaw told you, your dad's always going to be with you. And now you have him at the most perfect place.
No, and I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think part of that encapsulates the journey. The Independence Day part you referenced with Springsteen is obviously the song where he says, I can't live with my father. And I had elements and moments of that with my mom, because my mom and I's relationship greatly changed for the better after I went on this journey.
Yeah.
We had she was sort of the bad cop compared to my dad's good cop, hyper disciplinarian, worked very hard for everything she ever had, would be a constant reminder, kind of the Jesuit priest in our household of, you didn't earn that, you need to do better, work harder. And I resented that for some time. And it wasn't until I traveled with her one-on-one and I saw how she operated in the world like the ex-Peace Corps volunteer that she was, that I began to really understand her and understand why she was so hard on me growing up. That it was actually a sort of way of making you tougher and making you more understanding of the ways of the world. And so I ended up appreciating that. But I think overall, what I really learned here, aside from anything else, was getting to a place of peace about losing dad and then realizing the wisdom of the things you can learn along the way if you're vulnerable and you open yourself up to experience and to talking with people and going in and finding comfort and uncertainty in places where you may have thought a year or two ago that you never would have been, but now there's nowhere else you'd rather be. And there's a lot of value add to that.
Well, before we talk Bills Mafia, I want to squeeze in one last question because I know when you were in college, you worked on PTI, you did stuff with XM Satellite Radio. Did you ever want to work in sports instead of news?
There was a long time where I grew up, especially as a young kid, watching Stuart Scott and Rich Eisen and, Oberman and Dan Patrick and those great old school SportsCenter anchors. I was like, man, I would really like to do that someday. And as I got older and I did that on PTI and XM Sirius Radio, I enjoyed it. And then I went into the more hard news stuff. And what I realized while I was in hard news is that sports were such an escape that I didn't necessarily know if I ever wanted to work in it. I never say never, but I think about it. It's like, man, I like actually sitting down with my family and drinking a bunch of red wine on Thanksgiving and not have to be there freezing, in some game and cover it. Because when you cover politics, there's similarities, right? Like you're out in the field, you're out at conventions, everybody's back home, but no, it's a huge blizzard and you're out there. And I never say never. I mean, there's a lot of things I like about it, but it is those folks give up a lot. I mean, I think we glamorize it as we should, but you think about Jim Nantz, right? Who's just taking some time to step back. So Jim has reduced his schedule from what it was like 49, weeks on the road to now he's only doing 42. Like, that's a lot. And I know it's, don't complain. It's a great gig. It's a great gig. And Jim is one of the nicest people in the world and a wonderful ambassador for media in general. But there's a grind there. And for something like me, sports is such a release. I've been very scared about trying to pair the release with the grind.
Yeah. You're living in the Bay Area now. To watch Bills games, you go to the Bay.
I'm in DC right now, but I spend a lot of time.
Well, I was wondering, how are you? Do you have DirecTV watching the Bills games? I know.
Yeah, I did the Sunday ticket, but I do a lot of Bills backer bars in the West Coast. The 10 a.m. kickoff is not. It's not the best. Yeah, I'm a night owl, so I'm actually one of the few people that doesn't like the football starting earlier out west. Everyone else loves it. But it's weird because like 8:30 p.m. rolls around and you're like, oh man, I got 4 more hours and the games are all over.
Yeah.
Whereas on the East Coast, you can fall asleep in the fourth quarter and it's like close to midnight, right? And you're happy.
Well, it's interesting. As a West Coast guy, I love the 10 a.m. stuff. It's all I've ever known. I grew up in Seattle, live in Las Vegas now, so it's like, hey, I almost wish they were at 9 o'clock. To be honest, I get too pumped up for the games to start when they get to 10. But your Bills, last year they were the Super Bowl favorites. Season ended not quite how everybody expected. How are you feeling about them this year? Like, is this the year? Because it feels like they're a little under the radar heading into this season as opposed to last season.
That is exactly what I was going to say, and it's exactly where this team needs to be. I think the Bills last year had a hell of a season. It was very resilient, and we need to chart out what that year was, okay? It starts off in May with a terrible racist mass shooting in Buffalo. The team and the community are so interlocked. The team is there grieving with the community, is the shoulder for the community to grieve on, but internalizes all of that. They go into camp. They start rolling in the season. Things are going well. And then they have 2 blizzards that completely blow up any of the momentum or any really okay, nothing's easy for us. Like we have to travel to Detroit for a game. The players' cars are snowed in. There's a lockdown. People are dying in the streets of Buffalo. So they have to internalize that. Then you have the whole terrible thing that happened to DeMar Hamlin. God love him that he came through. It becomes uplifting, but that's a huge emotional weight. You had one of your brothers basically die on the field next to you, and you're expected to go back and play the next few weeks. So I think there was so much off the field stuff for the Bills that was really traumatic. That was a huge weight that wore them down. They never spoke about it. We could also add the medical condition of Kim Bagula, who was the owner, who that was kept close to the breast for a long time. So there's all these issues that they had to deal with, which I don't think the general public really saw into the degree of which people in Buffalo knew that it was hard. It was hard for this team, the pressures they were carrying. I think this year, with Rodgers being with the Jets and them getting all that New York media attention, with Miami supposedly coming back, Tua's got these big legs now, and he's working with the QB guru. I mean, good. I want every single writer to put the Jets and the Dolphins 1-2 in the division and forget about us. Okay, yeah. That's great. We have a hell of a schedule. There's a lot of primetime games, but I think this team is built to go 11-6. Get into the playoffs, and they're going to play loose. And that is all I care about, is just playing loose. They were so tight last year. And then the last thing I'll throw in, Isaiah McKenzie said this. He's now with the Colts. He goes, well, one of the issues is that the Bills are built for a dome. That's what it seems to be. Like, the offense just thrives in a dome. And that's, if there's one knock I have, is that, we watch those games. We got outplayed by the Bengals in the weather that should be benefiting us, right? Mm-hmm. And that was something that we have to pay attention to, is that if we were a dome team, we likely would have gone 17-0 last year. I mean, we were on fire in those domes, right? And that doesn't work for a team from Buffalo. And I think they understand that, and they're going to incorporate the running game more this season and get to a place of balance.
Yeah, you got to like Dalton Kincaid, because I think they'll be a 12 team this year. They'll put him on the field. They'll line him in the slot, but they'll also have a chance. And with Murray as the running back, I think, and I've said this all last year, they needed more power. They needed more physicality up front, and I think that gives them. But I agree with you. I think they're not the hunted. I think the Jets are now the hunted. There's a franchise that has had 13 playoff appearances since 1968, and yet they become this, oh, my God, we got everything going for us. So I think when you're not the hunted like the Bills are, I think it reflects on that. What is your favorite Bills memory growing up?
Oh, all right. It's the Don Beebe, Leon Lett causing the fumble there, which is just so emblematic of Buffalo. I was at that game with my father, the first Super Bowl I ever went to in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl. I remember that moment. I remember how upset we were because it was such a blowout. And then Beebe did that, and they replayed it, and you could see it, and you go, oh my gosh, that is so Buffalo. It was, we're losing, we're down and out, but Don Beebe is running back and knocking the ball out of that hot dog Leon Lett's hand, and we stopped them from getting that easy touchdown, and we never gave up. We may have been kicked down, but we never gave up. More recently, though, I would say a memory that I had that it just brought me so much joy is I went to the opener last year, the NFL kickoff game, which was the Rams and the Bills in LA. And it was the Rams night, the Super Bowl champions, and they were all celebrating, and nobody really gave the Bills a chance that night. And the Bills went out there and shut a lot of people up. And that was, at least for me, the first time I'd ever gone to an away Bills game where there was a lot of hype, where they not only showed up, they shut up everybody too. And that was a really neat thing to see for me.
Yeah.
Where are you going? Are you going to go to the games this year? What's your plan for the Bills this year?
They play in D.C. on September 24th. I'm definitely going to go to that. I will go to a home game. I'm contemplating. I should ask this to you guys. They play in London this year. Is it worth the trip? I mean, is the world traveler? I should probably go, right?
You should definitely go. I mean, I would go. You go spend all the time. There's so much there in London to see. Go to Chartwell and then see your Bills and watch the game. And I think those fans over there are so enthusiastic about football. It's just incredible. I would love to experience it.
Yeah, and the new Bills Stadium is actually based off the Tottenham Stadium, so that'd be cool to see. They're going to play their game there in England over at the one of their stadiums based off of. So I might go to that game. But this is going to be a really interesting season. We're coming up, I think, on some salary cap issues the next few years, so there is a little bit of urgency, but not to be the hunted is really good.
Well, you brought up the Bills Stadium, which leads me to my last question there, because I know there were some fans in Bills Mafia who wanted them to build the dome because the team's not quite built for the snow of the teams of the past there. Were you one of those fans there, or do you like the open air out there in Orchard Park?
I think what they're doing, and I'm not just drinking the company Kool-Aid, I think they split the difference, which is good, which is that the fans are protective. It's very enjoyable. If you want to sit outside of the elements now, you can, but there still is that element of snow and football that makes Buffalo unique. The dome sounds great in theory, but I just think that the history of the team, that for everybody who says they would have liked that, there's also a lot of people who have been like, that's just not who we are. It's not us. And so I think they split the difference, and it'll work out fine. But as I said earlier, I can only imagine last season if you had every game at the Dome, what it would have been like. Because there's a little bit of a greatest show on turf vibe that was going on there. It's something really spectacular to see.
What was the best thing you've eaten in all the 6 continents you visited?
The best thing that I've eaten in all the street food in Hanoi, Vietnam. And you sit on these little milk crates, so your knees are up near your ears. And these folks are cooking the food literally off the street. And you're in your mind like, man, I don't know if I should eat that. Like the charcoal grill is like 2 inches off where all these feet are. But you do. And you get a huge Vietnamese ice cold beer. And it's the best food you ever had. And you gain 20 pounds and you like it. But I'll tell you this quick story. So I go around Asia for about 2 months and I eat all this food. And I come back to the U.S. and my stomach is killing me. And I go, oh, man, I must have picked up some sort of parasite or something, right? And I go to the doctor and he's like, okay, so where did you do? I was like, I was traveling all around Asia. He's like, oh. He goes, welcome home. So what do you mean? He goes, it's American food you're eating, man. It has all the sodium. It's all processed. He goes, you were eating fresh food over there all the time. He goes, were you eating off the street? He's like, were you eating in Japan, like the fresh fish that comes in right off the boat? And I was like, yeah. He goes, here, I'm going to give you a secret. He goes, that guy in a rice paddy in the middle of Southeast Asia is actually eating healthier and better than you are in big, abundant America. Amazing. And it was amazing. It was wild.
That's amazing. That's unbelievable. That's a great story. That's unbelievable.
Yeah. No, I have something that kind of goes along with that because I've been to Uganda before. That's where my mom is from. I've been to Nigeria. My name is Nigerian. That's where my dad is from. And every time I go there, I'll eat. I'm never bloated, never nothing. I come back here, like you have one meal and it's like, God damn.
You feel it, right?
You feel it, yeah. You feel it 100%.
It's amazing. Yeah, there is a lot of sodium in our food.
Yep. But that's an awesome way to end it. Luke, we appreciate the time, man.
Thanks
Honestly,
so much,
thank
Luke.
you
this
so
was
much.
Awesome.
Obviously, the book is already out. You can get it wherever you get your books there. Look for me there. Grieving My Father, Finding Myself, New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller, Luke Russert. Man, we appreciate it, man. Be well.
Thanks, Luke.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it, guys.
Awesome stuff. That does it for this edition of the GM Shuffle podcast. We will talk to you guys on Monday. Thank you to DraftKings. Thank you to Beeson. Thank you to our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. Thank you to you, Michael. And thank you to Luke Russert as well. And we'll see you guys on Monday.